Welcome to the deep dive. You've handed us a fascinating stack of source material. John Stuart Mill's Writings on Socialism, the preliminary chapters, published back in 1879.
That's right.
Takes us right back to a really pivotal moment, doesn't it, when these socialist ideas were really starting to gain ground.
Exactly. And Mill, in his typical way, he set out to examine these ideas really thoroughly, impartially.
Okay.
So our mission today is basically to walk through his first steps. First, getting a handle on the socialist critique as he presented it.
Case they made.
Yeah, the case they were making. And then how Mill started to, analyze those claims, look at the practical real-world difficulties of actually doing socialism. And also, interestingly, how he challenged the whole idea of property itself.
Okay, right. Let's unpack this then. We'll dive into these sources, so focusing on the key arguments Mill laid out about what the socialists were saying and his initial responses.
And the context here is crucial, right? Late 1800s.
Post-1867 Reform Act.
Exactly. The working classes are getting more political power, and they're demanding attention, demanding change.
So Mill kicks this off by presenting the socialist critique of, well, the way things were. He calls it a frightful case they make. What's the sort of fundamental idea behind their complaints?
Well, the core idea is that the really big problems in society, poverty, inequality, all that, they aren't just like bad luck or inherent human flaws.
Not inevitable.
Not inevitable. They argue these things are consequences of the social arrangements we have, especially concerning property, production, how wealth is distributed. The system itself, they argued, just wasn't working for the general good.
So they look at the problems and say, it's the system's fault, basically, not just, individual failings.
Precisely. It's systemic. And the first big evil they point to, poverty.
Right, poverty. But wasn't the common idea then that, you work hard, save money, you get ahead?
That was the theory, yeah. But the socialists, according to Mill, argued that, look, despite that story, a huge number of people in, quote, civilized countries were living in absolute indigence.
Barely getting by.
Barely getting by. Insufficient food, no security, relying on charity. The system wasn't delivering.
And they felt the whole reward thing was backward?
Completely backward, in their view. They claimed reward was often in inverse ratio to labor and abstinence.
So the harder you worked, the less you got.
Pretty much. Those who labored most received least. They highlighted that things like who your parents were, sheer luck, opportunity. That stuff played a much bigger role in success than actual merit, virtue, or skill. In fact, they went further. They suggested that vices like being servile, selfish, dishonest, gambling, even downright knavery, could actually get you further than being virtuous.
Wow, that's a stark picture. And they saw bad behavior, crime, and so on stemming from this.
Yeah. Mill notes they traced crime, vice, folly, largely back to three things: poverty and its temptations, idleness among the rich, and just bad or non-existent education for everyone.
All failures of the social setup.
Exactly. Failures of social arrangements, not just individual moral lapses.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Beyond poverty, what's the next big target in the sources?
Competition. Big target. Socialists saw individualism and competition not as healthy, but as a kind of principle of private war.
Private war.
Yeah, based on opposition of interests, not harmony. Everyone's struggling, trying to push others back or down to get ahead.
So what were the specific problems they saw with competition, according to Mill?
Morally, they argued it just bred awful things.
Yeah.
Envy, hatred, uncharitableness, made people enemies if their paths crossed economically.
And economically.
Economically, Louis Blanc-Beaumont quotes him, called it a system of extermination for the people. He claimed it led to a continual fall of wages.
Which Mill questions later, you said.
Which Mill definitely questions later, yeah.
Yeah.
But Blanc also argued it caused ruin and bankruptcy among producers, especially the smaller ones.
Okay. And what about the idea of cheapness from competition? We hear that today, right? Competition makes things cheap.
Blanc argued that was provisional and fallacious, basically a temporary trick. The rich producer uses cheapness like a weapon, a hammer, to crush smaller rivals.
Undercut them until they're gone.
Right. And once they're gone, competition disappears, you get monopoly, and cheapness turns into high prices. They saw destroying the middle class, leaving just a few industrial oligarchs.
So it's a race to the bottom that ends with just a few winners calling the shots. That's the argument.
That's the socialist argument, Mill reports, yes.
Eh.
They also argued competition pushes producers to oversupply things.
How so?
Because producers are kind of working in the dark, not coordinating. They overproduce, and crucially, they can push the risk onto the workers' layoffs. unstable work.
Ah,
So you get this weird situation. Supply goes up, but consumers are getting poorer because of low wages, so demand actually falls. Diminished consumption, the opposite of what, economic science should aim for.
the sources also bring up the Fourierists, like M. Consideron. What were their main points?
Right. Mill looks at different socialist schools. Consider a key Fourierist adds a few things. One is this enormous waste of labor in society.
Waste, like people not working hard enough?
No, not just that. Systemic waste. Think about the army. Resources spent on crime, lawsuits, just the general lack of organization. He argued poverty came from this disorder, this waste, not a fundamental lack of resources. They also hit hard on the internal warfare and discord. Clashes between individuals, between classes, all driven by opposing economic interests, like wine growers versus corn producers on trade policy.
Right, different interests clashing.
And then a really big focus on waste and, frankly, immorality in distribution. The whole system of merchants, dealers, shopkeepers.
Yeah, that section was pretty detailed. What was the beef with traders and merchants specifically?
Considerant and Robert Owen are cited here. The main charge. The trader's interest is fundamentally opposed to both the producer and the consumer. They want to buy cheap, sell dear.
Okay, so the middleman's interest isn't aligned.
Worse than that. They argued traders profit from the general anarchy of the system, holding everyone else under their yoke. They basically accused them of robbing society in a whole bunch of ways.
Robbing society, how?
Yeah, get this list. Enormous, disproportionate profits, they claimed. Far fewer people were actually needed for distribution, driving up costs, plus pulling useful labor into parasitic trade roles. Owen said 19/20ths were parasites.
Wow.
Robbing through adulteration, watering down goods, adding fillers because competition forced it. Robbing through accumulations causing waste hoarding goods to raise prices, even letting them rot.
Like that rice example.
Exactly, the rice thrown into the sea. Robbing through shameless usury, lending at crazy rates, through countless bankruptcies that ruined others, while the trader often walked away fine.
It keeps going.
Oh yeah, robbing by buying low when producers had to sell, selling high later. Robbing by diverting capital into speculation stock jobbing, Owen called it odious. Robbing by monopolizing raw materials, jacking up costs. And all this multiplied by the insane complication of goods passing through so many hands. Owen called distributors dead weight, active demoralizers. So the final cost was often, many times, the production cost.
Quite an indictment. Anything else highlighted in the critique?
Yes. The Fourierists added the evil of repugnance for work. They saw typical labor as basically penal servitude.
Something you only do because you have to avoid starving.
Exactly. And this misery of work, they argued, was necessary to keep the many poor so the few could be rich. Their solution: work must be made attractive. And finally, they pointed to this tendency towards concentration of wealth, a new feudality, partly from competition crushing rivals, partly from things like national debts, making capitalists co-owners of everything, getting paid without working or risking.
Okay, that really lays out the socialist case, as Mill saw it. Powerful stuff. So how does he start to examine these points? He says some of it is unanswerable, but there's also exaggeration and errors, right?
Right. He doesn't just accept it all. First thing he pushes back on is that claim of a continuous fall of wages.
The idea that workers were just getting steadily poorer.
Yeah. He says, look, the actual data we have shows the opposite. Wages in civilized countries are generally increasing, and the increase is speeding up.
So not declining.
Not declining overall.
Right.
There are local dips, temporary problems, sure. But the trend, helped by progress and things like emigration easing population pressure, is up. Society is slowly rising out of poverty, he argues, unless bad laws interfere.
So he agrees wages are often terrible, but disputes the trend they described.
Exactly. The trend analysis was wrong, in his view, even if the current state was bad.
What about the big attack on competition?
He argues they have a one-sided notion. Competition isn't just producers competing to sell low, it's also buyers competing to buy, which keeps prices up.
Ah, both sides compete.
Right. And under really free competition, he says, it tends to equalize things. That idea of rich companies wiping everyone out to create monopolies. Wholly imaginary, he says, if competition is truly free.
But businesses were getting bigger, weren't they?
Yes, he acknowledges that. Consolidation happens. But, he argues, where it does, like with big factories using better machines, it lets them supply goods cheaper.
Which helps consumers?
Helps consumers, including laborers, and can even reduce waste by cutting out some of those middlemen the socialists disliked. And, importantly, competition still exists between these big players.
So Mill sees real benefits to competition then. Cheapness, mainly.
It's the best security for cheapness, he says. And this is but he concedes the socialist point that it's not a security for quality.
Ah, okay. Why not?
Especially in modern, large-scale business.
Mm.
Dealers aren't relying on personal reputation anymore. There's this gambling spirit, chasing quick profits. Intense competition, he admits, does lead to fraud, adulteration, short measures. It can force even honest dealers into bad practices.
So the problem isn't price, it's dishonesty about quality.
That's a key insight Bill draws, yeah. The incentives could be perverse when it came to quality.
So if competition messes up quality, did Mill have any fixes in mind?
He did. And interestingly, he points to ideas suggested by and partly grounded on socialistic principles, but ones that could work with private property.
Like what?
Cooperative stores, owned by customers or workers. He saw them as an effectual remedy for the problems in retail. Good quality, fair prices, without the temptation to cheat.
And for bigger fraud.
He suggests stronger social disapproval, sterner reprobation by opinion, and tougher laws. Society hadn't really used those tools effectively yet, he thought.
Okay. What about the claim that capitalists just take huge profits from the workers?
Snell thinks there's much misapprehension there. He breaks it down. A capitalist's income isn't just free money on their investment.
Right.
A lot of capital is tied up in machines, buildings, fixed assets. Another chunk, circulating capital, goes straight out as wages. The profit left over, beyond a basic safe interest rate, say 3 or 4%, he argues, is mostly compensation for risk, they could lose everything, and payment for the capitalist's own work. Their skill, their labor, the stress of managing the whole thing.
So it's payment for their input, not just ownership.
Largely, yes. He acknowledges successful managers get paid well, but emphasizes the risk.
Yeah.
His point is, if you took just that profit above the basic interest and gave it all to the workers,
It wouldn't make a huge difference to wages.
it would be inconsiderable, he thought. Less impact than, say, a new invention or getting rid of waste. He does distinguish this from income from national debt or loans to unproductive people that he sees as a burden. And he specifically sets aside land income for later.
So he's really pushing back on the idea that just redistributing capitalist profit is the magic bullet for poverty.
Exactly. He says equalizing distribution between capital and labor wouldn't create so large a fund as socialists imagined.
Yeah.
He wraps up this part by saying, look, the system isn't collapsing, the evils aren't getting worse overall, and no single fix will solve everything. What we need is calm comparison, and that means trying things out. Experimental trial.
Experimentation, right.
And he thinks the ideas from socialism, the moral critique, can definitely help improve the current system, even if full socialism isn't ready.
So experiments are crucial, but he also saw major difficulties with socialism itself, especially communism, right? What were those?
Yeah, he draws a sharp line between two types.
Okay.
One is a small-scale, village, or community model, like Owen or Fourier proposed. Mill thought this was workable. You could try it out with willing groups, see if it flies.
Okay, test it small scale.
Right. The other type, central authority socialism, revolutionary style. The government managing everything centrally. He called that obviously chimerical.
Pure fantasy.
Basically.
Yeah.
Wildly unrealistic, incredibly reckless to even try, especially with people not prepared for it. It promises quick change, but he predicted disaster and chaos.
So he's much more okay with the community experiments,
Right.
but even there, he saw challenges.
Big challenges. The number one issue, replacing the motive power.
Motivation.
Yeah. Under private property, you're driven by personal interest, work harder, get more. Under communism, if everyone gets an equal share regardless, what makes you really strive, that direct link is gone.
So what would motivate people, according to the communist idea?
Well, the interest common to all, making the community pie bigger, public spirit, conscience, honor, wanting to contribute.
And Bill was skeptical about that.
He was skeptical that for mankind as they now are, those higher motives would be strong enough, consistently enough, to drive unrelaxing effort, especially for dull, hard work. Education could change people over time, he thought, but that's slow. He worried communism wouldn't generate enough sheer effort. He also predicted it would likely lead to routine and a lack of enterprise. Stagnation. Because managers would need everyone's agreement for big changes or innovations. And getting a whole community to agree on something new, that's hard and slow. He even dryly notes, echoing Plato, that maybe the best people would only agree to manage out of fear that someone worse would do it otherwise.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah.
What about the regular workers? Would they work efficiently?
He compares it to hired labor under the current system. Workers on fixed wages often aren't very efficient because they lack direct interest in the outcome.
Yeah, makes sense.
Communist workers would also lack that direct personal interest beyond their share of the total. But Mill spots a potential advantage for communism here.
Oh,
The general sentiment of the community, peer pressure from your comrades, would strongly favor hard work. That's better, he thought, than the situation then where worker groups, like trade unions, sometimes actively restricted output or opposed efficiency measures,
so peer pressure could work in communism's favor.
potentially. But then he circles back. He says, wait, some of these benefits communism aims for, we can get them now within the private property system. He mentions piecework, getting paid per item produced. But more importantly, he highlights industrial partnership or profit sharing.
Where workers get a cut of the profits.
Exactly. He said that this is proven admirable. Why? Because it aligns the workers' interests directly with the company's success. Just like the communal interest is supposed to work in communism, but without ditching private property.
So it motivates effort, checks waste.
Right. Mill saw it as a practical way to get that motivational alignment socialists wanted, but within the existing framework. A way to borrow the good ideas.
Clever. What other difficulties did he see in the structure of communism itself?
A big one was having to make arbitrary decisions about things usually left to individuals. Like equal pay sounds fair, right? But only if work is equal, which it isn't.
People have different skills. Jobs are different.
Exactly. Do you make everyone take turns at all jobs? That kills efficiency from specialization. Do you try to assign tasks or rewards based on different abilities? That needs a dispensing power, someone deciding who gets what.
Which could lead to favoritism, resentment.
Favor or fraud, Mill says, leading to squabbles and ill blood. Making those judgments fairly is incredibly hard. He also foresaw intense rivalry for reputation and power. Once money wasn't the main game, people would still compete for status. And a real risk of the majority suppressing individuality, compression of individuality, especially on sensitive things like education.
So for Mill, the communist ideal might be okay for some hypothetical future state, but it depends on a really high moral and intellectual level that just wasn't there yet.
Pretty much.
Oh.
And it needed to prove it could work and even create that higher standard through successful experiments. Forcing it would be a catastrophe. And again, he gives Fourierism some credit here for anticipating these human issues and trying to design workarounds, making labor attractive, groups based on affinity, different rewards, trying to make it less demanding on average people than pure communism.
Okay, so given all these difficulties with socialism, especially the centralized kind, does Mill just throw up his hands and say, well, I guess the current system of private property is the only way?
No, not at all. And this is maybe the most radical part of these chapters. Mill argues powerfully that the very idea of private property is not fixed. It's variable.
Not set in stone.
Absolutely not. It's not some eternal natural law. It's defined by the laws and customs of a specific society at a specific time. It changes.
How has it varied? Did he give examples?
Loads of them.
Yeah.
Historically, the right to bequeath property, leave it in your will, didn't always exist. Often it was just yours for life. The earliest idea wasn't individual ownership, but family or clan ownership. He cites Sir Henry Maine on this. Even the head of the family had limits. Rights over land, hugely varied. Temporary ownership, like in Jewish law. Ownership split between the state, cultivators, intermediaries in parts of Asia. Feudal tenure, with all its obligations. Serfdom, limiting the landowner's power in Russia. The middle-year sharecropping system in Tuscany.
Where the tenant was almost a co-owner.
Right. Even in England, he points out, the freeholder is technically a tenant of the crown. It shows the historical layers and changes. And property rights have applied to all sorts of things over time. Owning other humans, slavery. Rights over public offices, army ranks. Public bodies claiming property rights over estates, which Mill thought was morally dubious, even if legal.
So what property is and what rights come with it, that's been constantly redefined by society.
Precisely. And this is key. Mill argues these changes have generally been improvements. They made things better.
Okay.
Therefore, he says, you can't just object to a new proposed change simply because it conflicts with the current definition of property. That's not a valid argument.
Because the current definition isn't sacred.
Exactly. Society is fully entitled to abrogate or alter any particular right of property if it decides that right is harming the public good. Provided, he adds, you consider fair compensation for anyone losing out. But the principle stands. Society can change the rules of property.
So what's the big takeaway here? Connecting this variable nature of property back to that socialist critique.
It totally reframes the debate. It means that if the socialists do make a terrible case, showing real harm caused by the current system, well, you can't just defend the system by shouting property rights, because those rights aren't absolute or fixed.
Hmm.
The critique itself, if valid about the problems, creates a reason to seriously consider modifying property rights to better serve the majority, especially those getting the short end of the stick now. The variability of property opens the door to reform.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've walked through Mill presenting this really potent socialist critique, uh, poverty, competition, waste, work itself.
Right.
Then we saw him examine it, finding some points valid, pushing back on others, especially regarding economic trends and capitalist roles, highlighting the huge practical hurdles for socialism, particularly statewide.
Yeah, the motivation problem, the risk of stagnation, the difficulty of fair distribution.
But then, crucially, he pulls the rug out from under the idea that private property is untouchable. He shows it's always been changing, and society can change it again for the public good.
It's such a layered analysis, isn't it? He deeply respects the problems the socialists identify, but he's also incredibly pragmatic about the difficulties of a total overhaul, given human nature as it is.
Seems like he favors evolution, not revolution. Experimentation, maybe borrowing ideas like profit sharing.
Definitely leans towards gradual change and small-scale trials. He wants to improve the existing system, informed by socialist critiques, rather than tear it all down unprepared.
It really leaves you thinking.
It absolutely does. And it raises this huge question, doesn't it? If Mill is right, that property can be redefined for the public good. And if the socialists made a compelling case about the harms of the system then, what aspects of property rights today might be candidates for modification? And maybe even more fundamentally, who gets to decide what the public good actually is in our complex world?
A lot to chew on there. Thanks for taking this deep dive into Mill's initial engagement with socialism with us.